In 949 BC, it's believed that King Solomon built the first temple on an imposing hill looking over the city. Roughly close to 400 years later, in 2 Kings 25, we read that the Babylonians, they destroy the temple. In fact, they come and they destroy all the important places. They burn them to the ground. Things are smashed and left, and people are carried off into captivity. And then in 515, so pretty much sort of like roughly 70 years later, Zerubbabel leads a mission, if you will, to rebuild the temple. And so it stands. They rebuild it, and so it stands for another almost 500 years. And over time, of course, it starts to deteriorate. And in 20 BC, King Herod the Great began remodeling it. He wanted to leave something, I guess, to impress people, to impress the Jews particularly. And so he uses his position and his access to capital to rebuild this temple. But it's not just a simple remodel in a sense of what was there, sort of buffing it up and making it look a little nicer. He's replacing things. He's making it much bigger. It's much more beautiful. And at the event that we're going to read about, the remodeling has been going on for 40 some years, 46 years, I think, to be exact, is what they believe. And so a lot has been fixed. A lot has been it's looking really good. And it's interesting, though, the whole complex and what he starts won't be finished for probably about another 35 years. The whole temple complex doesn't really get complete till about AD 63. And that whole renovation project is almost like 110 years in length. And so we have this beautiful temple they've been working on and fixing up for 40 some years. And the time is a week. It's during the festival or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So during that week, of which Passover is only one day. And Jesus, like all the good Jews who lived in close enough proximity to travel to Jerusalem, would show up. That was what was required of them, that every Jewish male was required to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year for the Feast of the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of the Tabernacles. And there were some requirements. The law of Moses required that they bring an animal to sacrifice, and it just couldn't be any animal. It had to be an unblemished animal. So they couldn't bring something like sort of called the runt of the litter. They couldn't bring like a lame animal, sick animal, it's going to die anyway. Let's just kill it here and give it to God. No, it had to be, you might say, their best. An animal unblemished, not a castaway, right? You didn't give God seconds. You brought him your best. And it seems that to sort of oversee that, there were inspectors. And also males over the age of 19 were required to pay a temple tax. And you didn't come and just pay it in whatever currency of wherever country you're living in. You had to pay it in, you might say, the Jewish currency. And so the Roman money that many of them would be using it was offensive. So the idea was then they needed money changers to exchange, currency exchangers, you might say, there as well. So those people were available. And then, of course, if you had to travel any kind of length, it was so much easier than to try to chase an animal from wherever, 40, 50, 60, 70 miles or wherever you're coming from, to just buy it on sight. And so there were cattle, there were sheep, there were birds for sale, and you could buy it. Now, of course, where there is need, then people come up and meet that need. And then if it's sort of and what would happen was, of course, that people sort of needed this, and there was, maybe you might say, limited supply in close proximity. And it seemed that there were merchants that were taking advantage of that, and these money exchangers that were taking advantage of this and making more than a fair profit, ripping people off is probably, we might say in our language. So this was going on, and they had developed all of this. It was very helpful in a sense for people, the whole idea, this whole machinery for people to come and offer their sacrifice and to worship. But they had set it up in a particular part of the temple that was known as the court of the Gentiles. There were different areas for the Jewish men, areas for the Jewish women, and there's this area for Gentiles who had come to worship God, who had come to faith and were going to worship God. And maybe there wasn't a lot of people like that at that time, in sort of over time, but certainly with the mayhem and the pandemonium and all that was going on, it did not provide, you might say, an atmosphere for prayer and for worship for the Gentiles. And so this is sort of the situation that we're in when we read our text from John chapter 2. In John chapter 2, verses 13, we read, "When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables and exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove out all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. For those who sold doves, he said, 'Get these out of here! Stop turning my Father's house into a market.' His disciples remembered that it was written, 'Zeal for your house will consume me.' The Jews then responded to him, 'What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?' And Jesus answered them, 'Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days.' And they replied, 'It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?' But the temple he's spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scriptures and the words that Jesus had spoken." And so we have John telling us about cleansing of the temple that Jesus does. And if you look at the first 4 books, we have 2 different accounts. In the Synoptics, there's Jesus cleanses the temple really late in his ministry, right in that last week before his death. It's the Passover time as well, and there's a cleansing. And of course, what happens there is, as a result of his actions, and he sort of makes this point that it's to be a house of prayer, that the Jews get together and say, "He's got to go. We're going to get him killed," and it leads to his death. Now, in John's story, this is early in his ministry, and he comes in, he catches them by surprise, and he's angry, and he's tossing things out, and he's chasing people and animals out, and saying, "Get these birds out of here!" And it's quite a scene, and there's some observations that are made by the disciples when they think back on this later on. They go, "Zeal for your house will consume me," right? That Jesus is concerned. He's a zealot, if you will. He's very concerned, and that's really, they're looking back at a psalm, a verse from, I believe it's Psalm 69, looking back at David's heart for the temple and looking at Jesus' heart for the temple, and the place, right, where people meet God, where people come to meet God, people worship God, people pray to God. It's this location, it's this heart for God that Jesus is really concerned about, of course, and they recognize this as they look back, that this was a real passion for Jesus. And of course, Jesus, he drives everybody out. He tells them to get out. Is sort of developed into this machinery, this business. And it was certainly, it had the, you might say, the necessary elements in terms of helping the Jews in their worship, but Jesus said, my house is not to be a marketplace. It's not a place for business in terms of money exchanging and buying and selling and squeezing the Gentile right out, right? It's to be this place of worship. It's a place where people can seek God, not have to put up with all this pandemonium. And I guess there is, even for ourselves, I think we can get caught up in the machinery of what we do in our faith and on a Sunday morning and miss out on God's heart for people. Miss out on why we're there is not, to get good music or to hear a good sermon. It's about, we've come to worship God and to pray and put God's interests, and you might say be reconnected sometimes with God's interests, be reminded to enter into those places and to express our love for God. In any event, right, they're upset, like, who do you think you are coming in and doing all this? Like, who do you really think you are? Why, what authority? Give us a sign to show us that you got the authority to do this. And Jesus sort of skirts that, and he talks about, he says that the temple, he says, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. And of course, they're looking at this beautiful temple thing. It's 46 years like to rebuild this. You're going to raise it in 3 days? Come on. And the disciples don't get it either. It's only looking back, right, that they recognize, the temple that he's talking about was his body, right? That there was something new happening here, that it was, instead of the physical temple as a way to meet God, Jesus was taking over that role. He was going to be the new temple, if you will, that in which people could meet God. And of course, there's the ripping of that curtain and Jesus' death and so on that sort of further illustrate that Jesus is now going to be the way to enter into relationship with God. And so Jesus is really saying he has gotten the authority. At one level, he's saying, I have the authority because from the Father. But they didn't recognize him as the Son of God. They didn't recognize what he was talking about. They didn't realize in that moment what they were missing out and what was happening. It was more about, who does he think he is? With irritation and anger. I read a story a few years ago. Well, it's from a few years ago, and I have since noticed that it's actually in YouTube as well. But it's a story that seems that one day, in a busy Washington, D.C. metro station, a man with an open violin case in front of him, he plays his violin for the passerbys. And of course, people are busy coming and going. You can see sort of people in the distance, and there's some children that come along and they're listening until their parents move them along. And there's some people that stay for a little bit. Some people, it may be a handful or less, that stay for, for maybe the whole song kind of thing. And so people are coming and going, and like I say, some stay longer than others. But for the most part, there's not really any that sort of just stay put for very long, very few. And his violin case was open there. And so some people put some money in, maybe a couple dozen people, put some money in if they'd listen for a couple minutes and then move on. And when he was done, he had collected a total of $32.17. And then the musician's name was Joshua Bell. And 3 weeks earlier, he had played to a packed house in Boston, where tickets for the good seats were $100, and the cheap seats went for more than the money that he had collected that day in the subway station. And unknown to practically probably almost every hurrying and distracted passerby, Bell was playing one of the most difficult and intricate pieces ever composed for the violin. And not only did he play it with world-class skill, he played it on a Stradivarius violin, valued at between $3.5 and $4 million. And the whole stunt had been set up by the Washington Post to see if anyone would notice. And for the most part, no one truly did. Maybe one or two. And too often in life, I think that likewise we don't realize what is standing right in front of us. Something like the people in the temple that day, they didn't recognize Jesus for who he was. Right? When Jesus showed up, it was business as usual. And he just sort of upset the apple cart, and he was treated with, they were annoyed, they were angry, they were like, who do you think you are? They didn't get the message that was given to them. They weren't even interested really in seeking what they could learn in a humble way. And the Jews had forgotten that they were to be a blessing to the nation. And so here they had really just crowded out that whole temple area for the Gentiles. And that was of grave concern, because that was their calling, that God was going to work through them and bless them, and then in turn they were to bless the world. But they'd lost that picture, that image, that mission. And I guess the question we need to ask ourselves is, have we lost that vision, that mission, that it's not just about me doing business as usual, but there's a whole world that's out there and that God has a heart for, and that we have opportunity to impact in good ways, in ways that bless, certainly with prayer. And there may be other opportunities, like Jesus says in that one story where he blesses the righteous. He said, well, you fed me, you gave me drink fed me when I was hungry, gave me something to drink when I was thirsty, you clothed me when I needed something to wear, you housed me when I needed a place to stay, and so on. And they said, well, when did that happen? We didn't see you hungry, we didn't see you thirsty. And it's like, when you've done it to the least of these, the hungry, the thirsty, the people that need help in various ways, you've done it for me. And so I think I just want to close with this idea that when things seem out of place, or our business as usual gets turned upside down, do we take notice and ask, maybe, is there something I should be paying attention to here? Should I be noticing something here? Is God at work in calling me to meet him in this place? And we know for the Jews it was a disregard for the Gentiles, and in particularly a welcoming place for them to worship. And perhaps it's always a great thing to be asking ourselves from time to time, what is my attitude toward others around me? Do I see the opportunity to see Jesus in the needs around me? And am I making it my mission to pray and care for the people that don't know Jesus? Thanks for listening.